The neurology of worry with Siddharth Warrior. That's a joke that I was waiting to crack all that while. Yo, man, thank you so much for being on the podcast. This is the Vinamra Kasana show. We returned after a long hiatus, just chilling. You, of all people, have fascinated me the most on the YouTube space. Before I get into stuff, a friend of mine was telling me that, you do these or have been doing these Bhagavad Gita streams at 6 a.m. in the morning, right? Which is,
8 a.m.
If 8 a.m., right? If we face the facts, it's an uncommon feat for the full-time YouTuber aged between 18 to 24 to have that level of discipline. But obviously, since you're a neurology practitioner, you come with, I don't know, like the workings of medical life to YouTube. How much of like your life has changed ever since you started broadcasting? Ever since you became more than just a medical professional?
It's been a very interesting thing that it changed 180 degrees in certain respects.
How so?
The idea of duality, the idea of how you don't have to be defined by just one thing. Especially for doctors, this is a fundamental challenge. All medical students grow up questioning who are they outside of this field. And most of them just give up and say, Abhi doctor hai to hai. There is a reason why the meme says that, how do you know if somebody is a doctor? You don't have to guess, they will tell you. That's the joke.
Right.
And I was thinking about that joke, and I realized that the reason that doctors will always introduce themselves as I am Dr. So-and-so, even if nobody asked, is because that is pretty much all they have, because they have spent a significant portion of their lives achieving that degree.
Yeah.
And for me, it was interesting because in the last 1.5 years, I started thinking about myself as many different things. But a YouTuber was never one of them. And when that definition sort of grew, I liked that journey. I still like that journey. I don't think it's anyway done. I think it's just starting. But the Bhagavad Gita discussion was sort of like a culmination of that. It happened in the last few months of 2020.
Right.
And after everything that happened in 2020, it felt like a good way to end it, because it just gives you perspective of a lot of things.
When you bring your ideas from YouTube and the content space back to your friends who, let's say now that you've sort of shat on them about like being doctors all their lives, when you bring insights from this space back to, I don't know, like the neurology table or like the cafes that you guys hang out at, what parts of your worldview are rejected, and how do you see your friends / colleagues responding to this new thing that you're doing? And do you ever feel like you can maybe convert them to also become broadcasters? Because I was watching Joe Rogan's podcast with Andrew Huberman, right? Who's again like a famous researcher in many different fields. Yes. Yeah. And he was saying something like he was expressing the strangeness of how he has become also a broadcaster from the science community to just someone from just someone who does research. And he was saying that's a big step.
Yeah.
Going from there to there. And like he knew all the people who in this field were doing the same thing as well. So for you and your friends.
So for me, I don't think, so it's weird when you say that, you're pulling somebody down or something. It's not that way. The idea is that
I meant that as a joke.
No, but it is something that I was thinking about. And I think that doctors are incredibly talented people. From all my colleagues that I know from my medical college and from 15 years in hospitals, the thing is that we are not brought up with that idea that you can be two things.
Right.
And this is not just for medicine, it's for, I think, all Indian children growing up. We are brought up with the idea that you have to be good at one thing.
Right.
And focus really well on one thing, and everything else is extracurricular. Everything else is, acha, do you also have hobbies?
Right.
And that is never as important as your one main job. And the idea that you can be two things is shocking and, in fact, discouraged a lot of times. And I would love it if I can play even a small role in changing that thought process. That great if you want to become a doctor, great if you want to become an engineer. Don't stop there. What else do you want to do? And why make it any less important than the first thing?
Indian Swiss knives are frowned upon, that's for sure. The only generalist Swiss knives that I see working in some capacity are just people in your family that you can rely on for everything. You know, the fixer guys who can do everything, right? And I wonder if they got education in tandem with the skills that they have, they would perhaps realize that, you know, they would find like the right career, like a mishmash, a bunch of things way later in life. But sadly, they're relegated to household duties and, you know, police se koi kaam nikalwana ya aise kuch kar dena. It's like some people who can just do everything. It's just basically generalists living amongst us who have some degree of respect from everyone in the family, but it's not something that can be elevated professionally. Like the only example I can think of maybe is media, because here's the pattern I see a lot in media, right? You have, so if you're an anchor, right, you can switch from being an anchor once TV sort of dies down and you can enter the YouTube space, right? Or you can be, you know, like the host on a YouTube channel. Then you can switch from there to have your own podcast. Then maybe a show on Netflix, right? Despite the fact that you started out as a writer, director, now you're an actor, now you're a host, right? There's still a pretty linear journey that you can trace when it comes to trying out lots of generalist hats, even though in the media space. I don't think that's the case for people in the medical fields. The only thing I can think of is, like, there is this other woman on Instagram that I follow called Psychotherapy Bar, who's basically, she's a psychologist and she does these 4 a.m. reading sessions and stuff. And to me, it seems like perhaps there might be more people like you, but you guys are the only ones broadcasting.
Absolutely. The idea of, can you get out there and share whatever you are outside of the medical space?
Right.
So all doctors are trained to go and see patients, go to the hospital, go take rounds. But then anything else that you have, can you broadcast? Can you share it with the world? That is left to you. Society doesn't encourage it. Society doesn't tell you how to do it. You have to sort of figure it out on yourself. And most people will take the line of least resistance and say, why bother? It's fine. I will draw, I will sketch, I will write poetry. It will remain in a small little notebook in my cupboard. My close friends might know about it. Hey, that's all I really want. And that's great. Except that once they start sharing, they find that, hey, that's not what they really want. They do want to grow. They do want to become better. They do want to get feedback. They do want to see what else they can become in that space outside of the medical world. And that only happens when you take that step, when you take that risk. And it is a risk, make no mistake. There is a risk of rejection. There is a mistake of people not liking them. And because doctors are so used to the kind of respect that they get in the hospital, they expect that everywhere. So then why risk it? Hey, why get called out for a shitty drawing if I can just step into my OPD and have 100 people get up and say, Are, Dr. Sahab, Dr. Sahab. I get it. But then you spent 10, 15 years getting there, right? So you spend 10, 15 years here and you will get there as well if you want to.
There is a certain doctor that I will not name. He's a homeopathy doctor. So that should make it very obvious for the audience watching from Faridabad. But I've been going to his homeopathy clinic since I was like 3 or 4. Parents are big believers in homeopathy. I'm not.
Sure.
And I remember going to these clinics and he has an open seating plan. So no patient doctor confidentiality, whatever, right? You have this table, sort of like the table that I'm sitting on or you're sitting on, right? And then right here, the patient will sit on this silver stool, you know, devoid of any respect. You're a patient, so I'm just going to move you around like this, right? And everyone else sits on long benches up, facing the table. So
it's like an auditorium.
Right. So you have everyone watching the other guy being treated live, right? And then because the doctor has been doing this for a while, I mean, he loves to talk. So he'll throw out an opinion like the way he throws his sugar pill wali jo wo hoti hai na, tablet ke dabbe aise, maar ke aise. He just throws it like that and he'll throw out an opinion. You cannot disagree with him. It's like, I see patients become lackeys and sycophants when they go to his clinic. And for the longest time as a kid, he would say, this kid is very obedient because he doesn't disagree with me. And I remember referring my friends to him, and they all came back, he's a very rude doctor. And I told them, well, because you didn't agree with him. So it's this sort of strange, circle jerk feedback loop of how awesome he is that he receives, that I think if he started to broadcast himself, he realized he needs to work on, having more critical thought. But
Calm the fuck down.
yeah, it's just very strange to see. I mean, I'm just realizing it now, as you said, that doctors maybe like to enjoy a certain level of feedback loop where they're reminded that they're experts, and any information that is basically a massive hit to your cognitive dissonance, they just ignore that.
They reject. Absolutely. And for a large part, it works because what is feedback loop for the doctor is also feedback loop for the patient.
Right.
So when 50 patients are in a room and one guy sees 49 of them agreeing that this doctor is great, whatever that doctor will give you, the 50th one will feel better.
Yeah.
That's the power of the placebo. You can't escape it.
Yeah, it's like community-based healing without you knowing that there's any shamans or I don't know, like shit like that.
Absolutely. Which is why temples don't take one-on-one worshippers or churches or mosques. Everybody has to gather in a group.
But you can go pray, or like, you can pray in private though, right? You can always enter sanctums.
Sure, you can, but you pray to a god who everybody else is praying to. Otherwise, why can't you just create your own god and pray to that?
Well, yeah, that's usually the disagreement I have with the parents occasionally, where they're like, let's go and do this specific sort of ritualistic devotion that we have been accustomed to do. And I'm like, but I want to do this other kind of specific ritualistic devotion that I myself have made in my head. They're like, no, these two things are not the same. Okay, we can choose to disagree. But it's strange, considering that you have a heavy neurological take on things. I'm wondering, does it not get taxing? People calling you onto different programs, collaborations like this, asking you, let's do the neurology of fucking guitars. And you're like, okay, what is your process like? Just going there.
My process in the last 6 months has been a very tacky one of somebody cracking a joke and telling me to do a neuroscience of dash. And that dash could be the most absurd thing that you can think about.
Right.
And when I hear it, the reaction goes something like this. Haha, that's funny. Oh, wait a minute. Hey, that's pretty interesting. Let me think about that one.
Right.
And then realizing, wait, so that thing does have a neuroscientific basis. For example, neuroscience of getting rejected in a relationship, neuroscience of not wanting to eat at 2 a.m. or wanting to eat ice cream at 2 a.m. Random things. And after you get over that initial, hey, what an absurd little topic, and then you start thinking about it, you realize that, yeah, that's true. Your cortisol levels go up, your hormone levels are fluctuating, you feel hungry at night. There is a reason that you get that hunger pang at 2 a.m. Whatever it is, everything eventually will have a biological basis if you go down that path.
Right. Yeah, I'm not going to pretend that I'm a guy who understands evolutionary biology too much. But I did try to parse through the first few pages of Behave by Robert Sapolsky. And the first argument that he sort of made about why his book is the most comprehensive book you ever need to read about biology is that he said that, most specialists come at it with their specific sword. So you're a neurologist, you can explain away the world by saying everything is a neurological event, right? Considering that you practice in this, maybe YouTube is one domain where you're willing to experiment and bring in new information to your existing field. Are there other medical / biological / even spiritual domains that you borrow from? Because maybe do you see the benefits of having multiple perspectives, because neurology can be in fact very limiting?
Yeah, it is. This is a wonderful question. And this is actually something that I was thinking about maybe 7-8 months ago in terms of how do you explain reality? And this has been the challenge that humanity has faced since a long time. And all these different aspects are ways of explaining the same thing, such as spirituality, such as philosophy, such as psychology, such as evolutionary psychology, such as neuroscience. All of these are different ways of approaching the same thing. Why are we the way we are? Or why are we here? So my channel has been essentially an experiment in trying to cover all these different takes. So I've done series on philosophy, I've done series on psychology. Bhagavad Gita was the first step into that spiritual take on it. And neuroscience, I'm not claiming that I get it.
Right.
There's infinite ways of thinking about it. There are so many different takes on this topic. But I think it's a good conversation to have.
I have a hypothesis that is partly borrowed from a lot of people, admirable people I follow on Twitter, where the entertainers of today will be the teachers of tomorrow, something along those lines. Because, like you said, it's very easy to have a PhD in something and be a navel-gazing academic, or even like, if you're fine with like, living a private life, whatever. But like, when people move, more and more people move to the internet.
Yeah.
I think those of us who broadcast the most, broadcast the best, will get to do it for everyone, something like that, right? And it's strange to see that the public on YouTube, in my own little experiments as well, don't really care about how good you are. It's more about, are you there every single day? It might seem like a trite thing to say, but I've been thinking about this more and more. It's like people are okay with letting you fuck up and learn along the way, because they are along with you as well, right? It's like, maybe you can say, what is the neuroscience of a hero's journey, right? And so in a way, you're saying, I'm going to try and occupy this space. You have far more credentials than I do, right? In the sense that you're a doctor, neuroscientist. I'm just a post-college student doing stuff on YouTube, right? Even then,
You're doing that very well.
Thank you. Even then, people are willing to sort of be with you on your journey and allow fuck ups, allow failures. Like, I started YouTube saying, I only know 7 or 8 things about writing that have helped me write well. I'll teach them to you. Nothing more, nothing less. And the feedback is fine. No one is willing to occupy that space. Please occupy that space for us. And I'm wondering if maybe, you or someone else who does something far more tangible in the medical space online will be able to have massive personal monopolies in the future, irrespective of private practice.
I have a theory that's been slowly building up, that nobody cares about your perfection as much as you. People are exactly what you said. I think you are very, very strict with yourself. You hold yourself to standards that other people do not. And that is great. That's great for your growth.
Right.
But if you allow those same standards to come in your way of you experimenting, of you trying something, then it's unfortunate. Because you're setting up barriers that don't need to be there.
Right.
And what you're saying is absolutely true, because every time I step out of my comfort zone even a little bit, so outside of neuroscience, if I say I stream a game, if I'm playing something.
Right.
And I get very annoyed if I don't play well, if I don't pick up the game quickly. The people on YouTube chat, the audience who are commenting, they are so patient. They are, just enjoy the game. Don't worry, it's fine. And and I just remembered that when you said that. Coming back to your question, I think that what we are seeing is a democratization of information.
Right.
That's what's happening. Information is leaving the hallowed halls of universities and Oxford libraries, and it is trickling down into the internet. It's trickling down into YouTube communities, Discord communities, Reddit channels. And eventually, the way we are going is that we are going away from institutionalized media and news and information centers, and we are going towards the Joe Rogan experience.
Right. Basically, we're all broadcasters doing our thing, and then saying that we can operate independently and then collaborate with other broadcasters without some big company holding us by the balls and saying, do this or do that. I often joke about the late night radio voice in India, where the Love Guru guy comes on, right? And it's this corporate voice. It's this corporate voice because he's obviously not allowed to say anything politically incorrect, not allowed to swear, cannot even go into the nitty gritties of the people he's advising, right? So what he'll do is he'll use some cheesy little metaphor about love. प्यार एक नदी है और देखो ये सब करना ही पड़ता है. And it sounds like an old aging swan who's fat and bloated speaking on a microphone about shit he doesn't know about. And the people who call, it's like shit. They're like, I am 16, my boyfriend is 18. Bitch, you should not be calling. You should go to the police. You know what I mean? So I'm so glad that we moved away from that corporate mishmash to just people putting out their personalities And I don't know,
Yeah.
some young YouTubers were telling me that this is the era of personality based content.
Yeah. Who do you trust? Who do you trust? In every field, in whether it's for entertainment, whether it's for news, whether it's for information, who do you trust? And that trust has to be built, that trust has to be earned. And I would personally want everybody who is in that position to constantly remind their audience to keep questioning them.
Right.
Although I know that that's not going to happen. Once you get that trust comes with power.
Right.
And you don't want to give that up. But that's what's happening. That's what happened in religion for the longest time, right? It's one person saying one thing and gaining followers, and that is what's going to happen in everywhere else as well. Even in the US, most of the people gain credible information through late nights talk shows.
Sadly.
They trust that person. Yeah, they trust Colbert, they trust Trevor Noah.
Yeah.
More, and even within news channels, they'll trust, say, one person, whether it's Inside Fox News or whether it's MSNBC, they'll trust Rachel Maddow or one person. And ये जो बोलती है, ये जो बोलता है, बस मैं उसी को मानूंगा.
Yeah,
So
I had this.
that's what's happening.
Yeah, I had this roommate who lived in an attic when I was staying in Boston as a college student, and I remember. I mean, he was clinically depressed, which is another thing entirely. But like, I hate to be a non-medical professional and say this. Part of the reason I think was the stimulation that he was doing unto himself all the time. This man's room had 24-hour news playing, constant in NPR, just streams of chaotic, non-related, anxiety-provoking information having nothing to do with you, just filling your head up. And so it was, every single conversation became political. I mean, every single conversation was about, this is a reflection of your values. Most of which were like, I don't give a fuck about Trump. I'm just here to study and then, enjoy my life. And they're like, why are you not upset about it? Because like, it doesn't really affect me. I'm just here, as a guest. But it's very strange to see while we as publishers enjoy the rights to publish our content, I wonder if you could maybe take me through what is like the neuroscience of consuming and stimulation via a screen, because I have my own thoughts on it. I've read like a couple of people, but I would like you to sort of give it the much needed perspective that is synchronistic with your brand.
I'll get to that. I just had one thing to ask. Were you there when Trump was elected? Were you,
I was.
Were you
I
in
was.
the US?
Yes.
All right. So then you must have lived through the answer to your question, because a lot of the information that got Trump elected and kept him in power was information transmitted through screens, through Twitter, through, I think the whole conspiracy theory world exists because of information spreading through screens.
Right.
And that is something that has been fascinating me recently, because after the recent US Capitol riots, I was reading about some of the QAnon. How do you pronounce it?
Yeah, I've just heard that name. Don't know what it means.
It's a very far right conspiracy group that has theories ranging from Bill Clinton is putting chips inside everybody through the vaccine. Oh wow, crazy stuff. No, Bill Gates. Bill Clinton was drinking babies' bloods. Bill Gates is drinking children's blood. Incredible stuff. And people are buying it. People believe it. So, yeah.
Yeah, just to stop you right there, I remember like the sort of lies that Indians like the conspiracies. That guy is actually that guy's father. Just like relatable stuff. Americans go for shit like 30% of us are reptilians. Like, okay. It's just it's a deeper level of delusion. There is no other way, because it's very, very, I've heard very crazy stuff in the US around what can be possible and what is actually happening, and how everything can be attributed to some grand conspiracy about like the pedophilia ring that the Democrats operate. Just nonsense stuff. In India, at least, there's like some juice in that gossip. Like there's some real event.
Did you say JUSIE or JEWS?
I said no. That would be funny. JEWS. No, I said JUICE. Juice, like juice, real
All right.
juice. Wala.
So, but one of the theories that I have on conspiracy theory is that if you want to feel superior, and of course you want to feel superior, we all want to feel superior. There are two ways to it. One is that you know more than anybody else in the legitimate sense. So if I want to know more about the political world than, say, a political expert, I have to read more than that political expert has read. I have to experience more than that political expert has experienced. But a far easier way is for me to come up with a completely alternate hypothesis that takes me 10 minutes and say that everything that political expert has read or said or experienced is false. I will end up with that same sense of superiority, but with minimal effort or no effort. All I need is 5 minutes of Facebook scrolling. And whatever makes you feel good with minimal effort, we will consume. Rule of thumb. Whether it's Cadbury chocolate or whether it's porn or whether it's conspiracy theory. If it's making you feel good, if it's making you feel superior, if it's making you feel sexy, if it's making you feel, giving you dopamine for zero effort, you will consume it. Conspiracy theory is exactly like a Mac burger. It's easy, it's cheap, and you feel good for that time.
Yeah.
And you feel superior. And yeah.
Have you watched History of Swear Words on Netflix?
No, I have not. No, I have not.
Yeah, I wish there were like at least some international sections, because there are so many anthropology and glossaries attached to Indian swear words that it's just English swear words. But anyway, they bring a bunch of neuroscientists on, which is why I wanted to like sort of talk to you. A big part of, not a big part, like in the sense, like I just love swearing, and my friends and I are one of the most meticulous swearers, and there are actually world standards for swearing in India, but we've gone to different groups and proven that we are actually the best at that. I wonder, what is the neuroscience of swearing?
Have you created words?
Oh, absolutely. So if you ask any linguist, right, it's got to the point where completely created terms can run an 3-hour conversation. Fine. Completely fine.
Yeah.
So I really believe that there's something superhuman happening there, something very magical. But yes, creation was actually the first sort of step into this whole group linguistic, dynamic. Let's create new terms, and it feels superior in a way as well, because then people would ask us, what do you mean by that? Like, oh, you want to know, you want to be in our in group, huh? Like, and we would never admit anyone. But yeah.
It is art. Let's not make any mistake about it. It is art. If you can create a new swear word, that means that your imagination and your creativity are at its peak.
Sure. I mean, yeah. It's very refreshing.
It has to be short. It has to be succinct. It has to be.
It has to stab you.
It has to stab you.
Yes. Because what? So I mean, my whole theory around swear words is, and I'm going to be very, very. I'm going to try to keep it as clean as possible, because this is an English podcast. Is there are two ways to fuck someone's mother. One is you just say, I'm going to fuck your mother, right? And that's pretty straightforward. Like, borrow from the English language, say it in Hindi, I'm going to fuck your mother.
Yeah.
It's said like it's something you say, like, hi, thank you. It's just one of those things.
Yeah. It's a formality.
Right. But if you want to inflict injury, real injury, you just add a layer of description. You go something like, I'm going to fuck your mother with a special salt, or like with a special drawer. I'm going to like just anything that adds more description to the whole scenario basically causes pain, number one, relief to you because you've succeeded at whatever you wanted to do. And third, it forces the other person to imagine. Because if you've got them at the images, you've got them wherever you want them to be. And so that's my theory, and it works every single time. I don't know. Can you maybe talk about the neuroscience of swear words?
So this is a good example of me going through that series of, hey, what a nonsense topic. Oh, wait a minute. Damn, right. This is brilliant.
Right.
Because that description can be anything. It can be visual. It can be auditory.
Yeah.
It can be, sent on the on any one of the senses. It can play on any one of the senses, and it can make that person imagine any of those things, and it will all make it real.
Right, right. Yeah. How does neuroscience help us in making things real?
I think neuroscience helps us understand what is it that makes things real. And the simple answer is senses. So I think you've hit it bang on the spot. Just like your jokes, just like your insult with the mother, you hit it bang on the spot. It was, if you add another layer of description, you are actually targeting another area of the brain.
Right.
So I'm going to fuck your mother. Sure. I mean, that you don't see it, you don't imagine it, but on your bedroom bed.
Right. Becomes personal.
Suddenly, yeah, you visualize the bedroom bed. You visualize it now. Now you can't escape it.
Yeah, isn't that like the saying where it's like an attack on all senses or the bombardment of my senses, which is roughly saying that, say you're inebriated in a really bad way, maybe you've a trip gone wrong, whatever, and then you arrive at like a concert, right, where people are auditory like Maximus, visual Maximus, right, and then kinesthetically also you're rubbing against people. It's a lot, right? That's like I need to retreat into myself because there's an attack on my senses. That's sort of what I think about bombardment. What do you think about that?
So if you think about each of your, if you think about your brain as a house, then every sense is a room. And so if all your rooms are in sync, if all your rooms are playing the same music, then you'll feel like your whole house is pounding. So if you are, which is why at an EDM concert, just like you said, the lights are flashing, the sound is at a particular rhythm, and the light and the sound is in the sync. And you are dancing, so your movement is in sync. You're touching, all of your senses are sort of in harmony. And so you get completely immersed in it.
Okay.
Imagine, wow, and now I can't stop thinking about it. What is the EDM version of an insult?
Yeah, what, like the DJ throws?
That would be the epitome of an insult. An insult that will take in all your senses. An insult that will make you visualize, hear, smell, taste, touch.
If you were like in the 30,000, yeah, go on.
Completely immerse you in that experience of being insulted.
The worst I can think of is you're on a bad trip that's going horrible. You've lost your friends. It's a 30,000 people concert. For some reason, the DJ suddenly sees you and remembers you're the guy who, I don't know, since we're having the fuck your mother joke, you're the guy who fucked his mother. So he calls you out, and the entire concert that's right now jiving in unison and good vibes, man. You sunburn and whatever that is happening. Everyone just makes a circle around you, and it's all you. And it's that specific sort of fear that if you get people to do a speech to text, a monologue of what they think inside their heads, it's like, oh my god, everyone is looking at me. Oh fuck, he's called me out. Like it's the culmination of all your worst fears. That's when I think that's my idea of like an EDM bombardment.
Has that ever happened to you in school? In the morning, after the morning gathering, and the school principal calls out your name, and then suddenly everyone turns to you, and you have to walk through the length of the hall all the way to the stage.
I've had something far worse. I shat my pants in school 3 or 4 times, and because I was too scared to go to the bathroom. This was in 1st or 2nd grade. I sat through the shit. I was forcing myself to, control it, but it would just come out. And imagine like, oh my, this is horrible, but like just that kicking up after hours. And so first, your partner starts to notice, like,
oh my,
and then it warps through the entire classroom, and then someone tells the teacher. And if you've been doing it for a while, she's going to be like, Vinamra, it's you again. So yes, I've faced all of that, but I just joke about it now. It's such a long time ago. But yeah, no, the reason I say that is because it's something that, people who teach social confidence will teach you about. People who are very socially anxious, or like even psychologists, they will force you to imagine the worst possible scenario of all your fears, culminated, multiplied, expounded, compounded, all of that. and then see that the reality isn't as bad as that.
One thing that I always think about is how we tend to think of ourselves as uh, done. This is me. This is my personality. This is
Right.
who I am.
Hmm.
And when you think of something like that, when you think of that happening to you as you were a child, because you were a child, you think that is in the past. I'm not that person anymore. And so I'm comfortable talking about it.
Right.
But we sort of stop thinking about it that way after a certain arbitrary age.
Which is?
I don't know. It's different for everyone. But if you make a mistake now, which is the embarrassment equivalent of shitting your pants when you were in first year, when you're first standard. If you make a mistake like that now, it's going to be much harder for you to get over it.
What, shitting my pants? Oh, I've done far more worse stuff, and I've been just fine. But no, I get what you're saying. It's this very interesting idea that people put a mental cap on their potential.
Yeah.
And so they जैसे potential यहाँ फैला हुआ है उसको समेट लेते हैं कि maybe I can spread my legs only this farther beyond my blanket, but nothing more, because quote unquote I'm spent. And now the next few years will either be me preserving this, what I've become for so long, or me just like, I don't know, figuring out other spiritual pursuits. I don't know. I see it a lot in the old people that I hang out with, in even people who had kids young. So they're psychologically, they've aged a lot. So when their kids grow up, they're like, now it's time for me to hang my hat and like just.
Yeah. Fear has a lot to do with it, because there's a lot of safety in saying that this is me and this is all I am.
Right.
So then it's sort of like a kingdom that is expanding, and at some point the king says, "Bas, I don't want to conquer anymore, because what if I lose? And what if I lose what I have?"
Which is a rational human drive. Would you agree?
It is. But then it also means you have stopped growing. And at what level is that balance? And I've personally come to the belief that if you're not growing, you're dying.
That's true.
There is no equal. What is that word? For stillness, for balance.
Equanimity.
There is no equilibrium. There is no such thing as equilibrium. Nothing is in equilibrium. You are either going up or going down. And it's sort of like that. If you throw a ball up, maybe there is a millisecond where that ball is hanging still in the air.
Right.
But that's not lasting. It's either on its way up or it's on its way down. And I personally believe that you have to keep growing just to stay where you are.
So that
or be okay with,
or be okay with wherever you are, and I have that quote unquote Zen-like contentment. That is, of course, such an ambiguous word in itself. But I wanted to ask you about, could you take me through your reading routines / consumption patterns that you follow throughout the day? Because, and I'm going to share a personal challenge that I faced. When you're broadcasting so much, it's very hard to. It's not that hard. It's doable, but it's hard to find the time to also educate yourself at the same time, because broadcasting, for me at least, demands an immersive experience, an immersive phase, right, where massive output is being produced, and that leaves little time for consumption. But I'm wondering, since you have a few more years of experience on your belt, and you've been sort of like reading your researches, academic papers, doing experiments, and then talking about them privately in the medical community and now on YouTube, and then to your patients, what have your consumption patterns been, and how have they changed ever since?
It started off with consuming for fun. Initially, everything was the books I used to read, all the content I used to consume. It was all for fun. And gradually it went to the complete opposite, where every consumption was academic, medical. You are reading because you want to learn more about diseases, about for exams, to crack exams, to treat patients. So that's the opposite extreme. And now in the last 1 or 2 years, it's sort of settling into this nice balance where you are reading for a specific purpose, but you're also reading for fun. And that fun has become the purpose. And it's still in process. I'm still not completely it's still not a completely formed path. But one thing I've realized is if you can somehow add a little bit of discipline to your purpose, in the sense of, I'm going to read this book, but I'm not going to get done with it just like that. I'm going to do something with it. So if I'm reading Sapiens, I'll make a note of the stuff that I think about, and I'll maybe make a video on it.
Right.
Or I'll have a small little book club on it. Or at least, at the very least, create a tweet out of it. It doesn't matter.
I love
what
that.
you do.
I love that.
Yeah. But some way to document it, some way to document that you have done this is enough.
Yeah. I say this about broadcasting any idea that you've just recently internalized is it's excess information in your head. If you don't put it out, it's going to go away. And once you put it out, it's going to get cemented as something that you did, something that will start another ripple if other people are interested. That's what I do. When I read books, I make book reviews on YouTube in Hindi. It's like, मेरे को ये किताब अच्छी लगी, इसमें ऐसा था, वैसा था, बढ़िया है, पढ़नी है, पढ़ लो. And it's just like, I want to leave that message out because the internet allows for that. The internet isn't privy to stuff like, आज मेरा mood नहीं है तेरी बात सुनने का, which is saying that, sometimes not every time can you have your friends as audiences for every single experiment, idea, mumbo jumbo that you do, right? I want to take things in a slightly different segue because on my other channel, I make writing videos, right? As I've told you, where I teach people how to write better, how to get out of their own way, how to basically shift their identity to people who can write. Because for some reason, writing, quote unquote, as we know, the practice is seen as something only the Tharoors and the Bhagats of this country can do. And I think that's wrong because people text each other all the time, right? Yeah. So you are writing in a way. So it's just, I'm wondering what is particularly the neuroscience behind writing and just writing without thinking, just writing.
So you can think of writing as an extension of language and language as an extension of communication.
Right.
So it starts off with that. There's a reason that most people are right-handed because the language center is in the left side of the brain.
And they're inwardly connected?
Yes.
Okay.
And so the right side of your body is controlled by the left half of your brain.
Right.
And which is why initially the child will start gesturing with the right hand. That's why you write with the right hand. That's why even when you talk, all the gestures that you make are easier with the right hand.
Right.
And it is a form of communication. Everything is communication. You want to convey your information outside and you want to get what somebody else is saying for your benefit.
Sure.
It's all exchange of ideas between you, me, everybody around us. So speech is an extension of that. As we go on speaking, we get more, and it's a more efficient way of communication as opposed to just gestures. And writing is even better way of communicating because you can store it. Fundamentally, the neuroscience of language is this. Now, if you go specific into writing, you involve a very interesting aspect of muscle memory, which doesn't really happen in spoken word. So in spoken word, you are just, yes. So in vocal cords, not so much because the part of the brain that controls your fingers and your hands, it's very big in your brain. And so if you're used to writing out, you are actually incorporating more and more parts of your brain. You are incorporating your visual centers. You are seeing what you're writing. So there is a little feedback there. As opposed to when you say something, there's no feedback. You're waiting for somebody else to respond to you, but you can't see or you can't hear what you have said afterwards. Which is why, say, when I write a poem, I never try to create the whole poem in my head. I write it down. Whatever nonsense there is in my first go, I write it down. I see the whole thing. And then I cut it. I cut the words that I don't want. I write over it. I scribble over it so that the entire thought process is in front of me. And for me, that makes a big difference. To see the mistakes that I've made, to see the initial thought versus what came later. And I realized this when I started writing on the iPad. And on the iPad, you have an option of erasing the word as opposed to cutting it. And I realized I didn't like that. I didn't like erasing. I want to see the earlier word. I want to see my initial thought, the one that I didn't like, because that tells me as much about what I want to write as the one that I do select.
Right. Yeah, it's very funny. When you were saying all those things, I was like, it's surprising that you've arrived at those intuitively. One of the first things that I was telling the people who watch my content is, if you think you can just figure yourself out using speech alone, the issue is it flies away. Parts of it can remain as images in your head or as quotes, but that's about it. Writing allows you to freeze your thinking on paper and see how much of a deviation from the first original thought or draft is the second draft. And you can take that conscious journey from 1 to 2. And it's a very literal way of saying, imagine like your page is like a NASA space station and you're like an astronaut doing research on it. So you can see, repair work on it, and you can see how you molded it, how you crafted it, how you took things out. It's very interesting. But I feel like the more and more people I tell about free writing, which is basically using your muscle memory and writing without thinking, without putting your pen up from the paper and just writing for 4 pages, which is a very popular method that Julia Cameron advocates in this book called The Artist's Way, right? I just told that to people, not even my original idea, I just told that to people in Hindi, and they're like, this has changed your life. And I'm like, well, I'm wondering what's the reason behind it. Does the newfound freedom of being able to write without thinking about what's coming, just letting your subconscious come out, does that help? Or just the sheer joy that you can actually write beyond the constraints of academia and professional commitments just for yourself?
I think that if you free write, you are actually exposing yourself to a side of yourself you didn't know.
Exactly.
And the reason is that we lie to ourselves so much. It is beyond belief how much we lie to ourselves. And the only way to see it is either to have very, very good friends who will tell you in your face ki, tu bachchodi kar raha hai, tu kya kar raha hai, this is not who you are.
Right.
But an even better way is to put it all out. Put everything out and then read it and then realize what has been going on in your head. Which is, it's a very small variation of this is how when you see a photograph of you or when you suddenly see yourself in the mirror, you get that small sense of surprise that, oh, is this what I look like?
This is who
this is who I am. And that's a very small version of it. But when you free write, if you've written, say, 10 pages without thinking, and then you read it, a lot of things will come out that you're constantly suppressing.
Yeah.
Because you run out of lies.
Interesting. You're forced to like, okay, now I have to address this specific thing that has come up. I cannot avoid it, which is like to some degree, that's an unorganized way of basically reorganizing your past, doing some degree of, Jordan Peterson's self-authoring, past authoring program, right? That's basically writing about traumatic / significant / happy events in the past and seeing what you've integrated, what parts of you are still left. But it has to do with the psyche. That's what I'm getting. And it's surprising that you arrived at that, again, organically. It's interesting that you arrived at that. Do you try that as well? Have you ever free written yourself? No.
Only in poetry, never in prose.
Interesting. Yeah, I wonder if you do it in prose, you'd find stuff.
I'm very fascinated by this thought because I have not thought about it in this particular way before. But in poetry, what happens is I usually write in rhythm and rhyme. So I write in meter, and but I don't try to force it. And I find it very interesting because if I have say 4 words to fit into one line, and they could be any 4 words,
right?
The way those 4 words come to me tell me a lot about my state of mind. So which are the words that I pick? I don't know. They will come, and they'll only come if my previous line is in place. And but it's not a very conscious thing though. So I should definitely try out free writing prose.
Free writing is anything but conscious. I mean, you're consciously deciding to do this, but beyond that, everything that happens is from the quote unquote collective unconscious or your own unconscious, which is weird because this is the sort of way that, writers and musicians will talk about the muse. Aretha Franklin had this famous quote that, you can almost retrace a song. You just have to sit and write the first line and it'll all come to you. I'm like, that's weird. But it's what we've been circling around is something that can now be pinpointed to with psychology and to some degree neuroscience. Key, what you're basically experiencing is the repressed part of you. But for the longest time, musicians and artists have used that to channel into their art and call it the muse, the goddess, whatever.
Sure.
It's very strange how these two worlds come at it.
When you talk of neuroscience, you can actually think about this as neural networks making new connections. Right. So art is when two neurons who have never really connected in that particular way suddenly realize that, oh, we can talk to each other. And the reason that they couldn't talk to each other till now is because we were suppressing it. So 90% of the receptors in your brain are suppressed. There's something called as GABA, which is a chemical that suppresses neurons from firing. And most of the activity in the brain at any given time is GABA, which is inhibitory. And when you sleep, or when you are high, or when you're daydreaming, or when you are in an artistic fever, your inhibitions go. And you start making random associations. You start seeing things differently. You start feeling things differently. Depending on the chemical in which you are high, if it's artificial or natural, you can have very different effects.
Yeah. What if that happens to you all the time?
I mean, you are in that fever all the time. Difficult because reality sort of depends on you seeing things in a particular way.
Yes.
So it's difficult to function. It's difficult to drive if you see cars as birds.
Or as
which
hostile.
You could. Or as hostile. Oh, wow. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's very strange. I try to pay attention to how I'm inside the car when I'm driving. Because if the world outside looks hostile, maybe there's something wrong with the way I'm looking at it. So, I've driven under some pretty stressful circumstances. But I want to get to that thought. How like these two neurons that were like neighbors but never said hello, and now they're like, oh, we actually have the same interests, right? Now there have been very. I only remember skimming over this on this Facebook publication called Big Think, but they had this research of how psychedelic use allows you to incorporate parts of the brain that haven't met before, and this is something very similar. Basically, it incorporates whole brain thinking, and this is something I read in this book by an author. I forget his name, but it was about the 7 principles that made Leonardo da Vinci. One of them was, he actually penned them down, was art scientia, something like that. Basically combining the arts and the sciences. And then one thing, something else was called systems thinking, right? So basically firing up all of his systems to think about things, because he was a party planner, but then also an inventor, a mathematician, but then an artist, but then something else, right? So being able to come at it from different angles. But he talked a lot about the brain as well. I'm wondering what you think about what is the way to get as many neurons to fire up before in a way that they haven't fired up before.
So the one thing that I dislike about psychedelic, the effect that psychedelics have is that it is uncontrolled chaos.
Yeah, even with clinical trials?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
No, so what does that mean? What do you mean by that, clinical trials?
So you can basically administer someone LSD in a clinical trial in a controlled setting and play specific music that incites past memories and help them overcome PTSD, trauma, depression.
Sure. Sure. That is in a very specific setting. The idea is that you are not in control of it. So the person who is taking the drug is not in complete control of what is going to happen, where it's going to happen. And you can't switch out of it, switch back as and when you want. But the fundamental principle still remains the same. You are removing inhibitions and you're allowing neurons to connect.
Right.
And I feel that artists have that capacity, although to be fair, a lot of artists do drugs because for this very reason. They want to feel that sense of giveaway, that sense of loss of inhibition. And maybe they have felt it a couple of times naturally and they have lost the spark and now they want to get it back, and drugs are the way to go. But then if it's possible naturally, it's always better.
Yeah, no, there's several rock star biographies that say they were successful despite the drugs. What do you think? They were successful because of the drugs? They made it horrible. But no, I still want to talk about what are some ways to, let as many neurons fire up. I have the answer, but it's a colloquial answer. It's like putting yourself in as many strange and uncertain situations as possible without bombarding yourself, allowing yourself to maybe move your body in ways that it hasn't moved before, being in places with different people, using the power of compounding. But those are just my own general brushstrokes around this thing.
Yeah. So my theory is that there are two reasons why your neurons will not talk to each other. One is if you are too comfortable. So if you are absolutely within your comfort zone, everything is going perfectly according to plan, nothing is stressing you out, they will not talk to each other. There's no need to talk to each other. Why? Creativity needs a purpose.
Right.
Other reason they will not talk to each other is if you're too uncomfortable. Because now it's about survival mode. Screw creativity. This is not the time to be creative. Run.
Right.
You're going to die, you asshole. Don't think about poetry. But there is that middle ground. And it's very interesting how, if you can somehow figure it out, where is your middle ground? Can you step out of your comfort zone, which is exactly what you said. Find yourself in new people's, find yourself in new places, meet new people, experience new things, and still somehow manage to keep that zone of creativity alive where you don't shut out. You are not retreating into your shell. You're not threatened, which is what will happen, because if you suddenly find yourself in the middle of a war, it is definitely a new experience, but you're not going to be creative then. So controlled chaos is probably the best way to make sure that you are in that zone of creativity.
Yeah. Have you seen those X-Men movies where they will have these massive rooms and they simulate what it would feel like to be in combat?
Yeah. Also, I think this was in Deadpool, right? Somebody was, they were trying to make him mutate. They would make him mutate by increasing the amount of stress. Like they would shock him, they would put him in hypoxic chambers, they would try to drown him. And at some point, his genes would just suddenly mutate. And that's a very far-fetched idea, but the concept is good. That the right amount of stress can do amazing things to you.
Yeah, the first image that came to my head was of this domesticated pink pig that you would often see at a farm. And then I read research that said that if you leave it back in the wild, it'll become a wild pig. It'll have to deal with hunger. Horns will grow out. Hair will grow out. Testosterone will rise. I'm like, oh my God, that makes so much sense. You're basically asking its genes to like fire up because we're in the wild now. It is fight or flight. That's what he does.
So creativity is actually our body's way of surviving. In the right circumstance, you will create because you have to. So we think that we are creating because we want to, but actually we're creating because we have to. So all artists have that inner sense of something missing, which is why you create. Otherwise, why will you create? You're perfectly happy. Happy people don't create much.
Well, I think you can be happy and creative and very generative. I often think that creativity isn't very closely tied to broadcasting. That's just another an element to it. I've seen and experienced several, epiphanies, creations just happening via a conversation that takes an unexpected turn, or just things in private life that don't seem like मैं कुछ draw कर रहा हूँ या कुछ paint कर रहा हूँ. The very obvious, pat definitions of what creativity is. It has to do with like the performing arts or the visual arts, but it's so much more.
But do you feel that all artists have that sense of something missing?
For sure.
Which they feel momentarily satisfied after they see their work of art that they've just created?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. Like I think I saw myself as an artist as like a 16-year-old, 18-year-old, but now I don't know what I see myself as. But there is immense relief in being able to just express. Not even to inspire or educate or persuade, just to express. It's about that same idea of like, can you convert it into a tweet? Can this be a podcast? Can this be a YouTube video? It's just that you want to express it or it will die. It's almost like you are impatient with your insights and there is no time. It has to be said now or it will perish forever. That's the way I feel about it.
I'm so happy that this conversation is being recorded, and it's reminding me of all the amazing conversations that we've had in our lives that were not. And they have felt wonderful. And I'm sure I learned a lot, but for the life of me, I can't remember what was said.
Right.
And this circles back all the way to how important it is to document. Because if it's not documented, it is gone. It will remain as a vague sense of, maybe it has changed my personality in some undefinable way, but where is it? Where are those conversations? I have a huge sense of loss for conversations. I think conversations are sort of like the bedrock of society or all growth.
It's necessary. There are people who will come and say, I love deep conversations. And then when I engage them in conversation, I find nothing. And even then, it's like, I remember my deep conversations. I hate to use that word. But then I realized these conversations need to be broadcasted. And so I came here, right? And you cannot, what I'm saying is eventually these things have to elevate to a level where either you take it seriously or you make it a hobby or you say, fuck it, I'm going to broadcast it. In fact, I'm thinking about like the numerous conversations, because we are a very collective society and we love to talk, that happen at every Chai Ki Tapri in India, that happen everywhere. What is it? Is it half parts the news of the day, half parts the town crier said this, half parts this was on someone's WhatsApp status, half parts what is written on the Bharat Times, half parts my beti is sick. It's like a basala of, it's a marketplace of conversation. It's happening at all times.
Yeah, it's just that is the free market. Like that is the free exchange of ideas. You get to pick whatever you want. Everybody's selling different things, and that's great. That's
what I think about social media as well. I think of it exactly like a bazaar.
Yeah, it's the original capitalism concept. Everybody's selling their own, which is what broadcasting is. That's what they mean by your personality is your content, because that's what you're selling.
I know you're short of time, and we'll have to do a part 2 for sure, Siddharth. It's been a blast having you on, and to get back to what you were saying about not remembering what was talked about, I agree with that completely. I love to pick as many topics I'm semi-superficially interested in and superbly interested in with my guests in a short period of time, so we cover a lot of ground, and there isn't time for deep dive. But what that does is it allows for a topic change. I don't know. It's like embedding small talk into an intellectual conversation. Yeah. I don't know if that makes sense.
Absolutely. It's a great way of keeping the audience's attention, because whenever you go too deep, it gets technical. And they will change the channel. And so it's great that you are changing the channel for them in terms of topic.
I'll be honest. Some things I'm just not as interested in. That's what I'm saying. It's just, I'm just like, I want to speak about this thing and then this thing and then this thing. And then let's see what he brings up, blah, blah, blah. But we don't need to get into a meta conversation about a conversation that we're broadcasting right now. We could spare that. It's been great having you on this podcast. It's been such a fun time. We'll do a part 2 for sure.
Absolutely. This was super fun. I would love to extend an invitation for you as well. Wednesday nights are going to be podcast nights on my channel. And but I usually like to pick up a topic and keep circling the conversation around it, like take it from different angles. So if you're up for it, I would love to have you on.
For sure, man. It'd be my honor. I'm happy to talk about whatever it is that you want me to talk about.
Perfect.
Cool. Fantastic. And so people can follow you on Twitter at Siddharth Warrior, right?
Yes. Or Sid_Warrior.
Sid_Warrior. Yeah. We also get tagged in a lot of things together. That's how I saw your name start popping up first. Like a lot of people tag me, you, Prakhar, Vedant, Rusty, Varun, a bunch of other people together. It's very strange.
Yeah, Varun. Yeah, all those guys.
Yeah. I
haven't spoken to Vedant yet. I think I will reach out to him.
Yeah.
I'm sure that this is a small group now. Eventually we will all get to know each other.
Yeah. Whatever this is inching towards its finality.
Okay, man. It's an interesting time to be alive.
Yes. Let's end that on the most science fiction-y hope note possible. It's an interesting time to be alive. All right, man. Take care, Siddharth.
See you, man.
Bye-bye.
Bye.